my screen.
Mute myself.
All right, Tony, there you go.
Okay, so let me start by saying a lot of this is already addressed in Ortelius, but I thought of a few things. So first of all, I just sort of as a positioning, what's different if you're building an application out of microservices? And, the first thing is, keep that on that first slide, if you would, Steve. Microservices aren't libraries. Okay, a library is typically something you grab from someplace, it gets put in your code, and it doesn't change until you change it. You don't have that same control over a microservice. So in Ortelius, there are things like, the notion of versioning is pretty well addressed, but it's an important point. Another, I think, point is, and as far as I know, this is true of Ortelius too, a catalog doesn't actually hold the services, it points to the services.
Yeah, that's correct.
Right, and those services might well be external. If you're doing a travel and expense system, you might point to something like American Express is used by many, many corporations. So you're going to invoke some services with them, and you may not invoke others. So, for example, in my career, I've worked for companies that let you accrue your American Express points, and I've worked for companies that didn't. So you have different ways to interact with the services based on that. I don't know if you'd get free expedited shipping, however.
I have no idea. I just clicked on something and it went crazy on me.
Well, it might be cool if you want that kind of shirt to order it.
Let me go
Probably
back.
probably a rogue microservice.
Yeah.
So anyway, the point being that those services may be somewhere else. So essentially go to the catalog to say a few things. And let's go to the next slide, Steve, maybe. And there are only two, I promise, guys. So if I'm building an app, first thing I want to do is, even before building it, I'm probably architecting it, is, are there services out there that I can use? Because if you think about a large organization, thousands of applications is not crazy. Well, maybe it is crazy, but it's not unheard of by any means. And if you think of those applications being composed of services, one of the things you run into is, okay, I've got to build my new app. I'd like to understand what services are available for me to use. So I probably want to look at various attributes. And in Ortelius, that's, there's a whole set of attributes that are well described. But I presumably would like to understand things like where that service comes from. Has it been rated by anybody? This is not an unusual thing these days. Is there's 3 services that all do the same thing. Which one's highly rated? Now, if I'm a manager of a catalog, which is over on the right-hand column, I may want to deprecate the lower rated services. But first of all, I have to be able to see ratings and in fact give ratings. I'd like to understand where the service came from. I don't know if you guys follow a lot of cybersecurity, but there was a report in the last couple of days of some, in this case, it was libraries are commonly used that purported to be maintained in America and actually were maintained in Russia. We don't want to get too US centric, but the notion of where do these things come from matters. I'd like to understand, again, when I'm designing in a service, what about the non-functionals? Is there some performance target? If the service is something like look up customer for a travel loyalty program, how long do I think it ought to take? And by the way, is there any measurement of it actually taking that long? What about availability? Are there commitments on the service provider part to some amount of availability? You can get into a bunch of other stuff like security of services. But then once I've done that, I want to be able to select services such that the app, when it runs, can actually bind to those services and presumably also release bindings. And then another one that's quite central to Ortelius is, can I understand this SBOM for the service? And I think Ortelius does that particularly well. SBOM understanding, is it changing, and so on. But these again were thoughts that someone that's using this would probably care about. And then someone that's creating a service, well, you want to be able to publish it. You want to be able to update it. You want to be able to say, we're taking it away. You'd like to know what people are saying about your service. Is it rated well? Is it rated poorly? Who's using this service? I have run into cases where things like services are being consumed. You also see this with data structures, by the way. And you can't even tell who's using them. You just know people are in their apps. I also, if I'm publishing a service, I probably want to say something about the security rules around it. Can anybody choose to use this microservice? Do they have to authenticate in some fashion? As we move a world of zero trust, that becomes more important. I need to protect my service. What about usage rules? That goes with my, non-functionals. Is this service available 12 hours a day, 6 days a week? What if you try and use it outside those hours? What if you try and call it more than I thought you were going to? Sort of the overuse. And then I'd like to see who's consuming that service. And where I'm going with all this, by the way, I think this should line up with, assuming people largely agree, which of these things are being developed, which ones already are developed, how would a user of Ortelius understand these? And then, if you go over to somebody who's actually running the catalog, they probably want to do a lot of the things that a service author does. So, for example, can anybody publish into the catalog, or do you issue some form of pull request that the catalog operations manager has to say, yeah, okay, it'll get published? What if someone wants to update a service? If you get into, for example, regulated industries, there may be an expectation that the results of an application will not change due to somebody pulling an underlying service out and putting in a new one. Lots of stuff around that. Obviously, I may want to, as an operations person, have a fair amount of say over security.
Can I ask you a question quickly?
No,
are you talking about, sorry to interrupt you. So you're talking about, for example, I work remotely, but I work for a European company, right? I'm only allowed to work and I'm only allowed to see certain types of data because of GDPR, right? Is that what you're kind of breaking down now?
Data's a little bit separate, Sasha. There's no question that data sovereignty matters.
Okay.
So data sovereignty means, for those that haven't really dealt with it, you put your data someplace, say within the European Union, and expect that usage is governed by EU rules, and it may well require data doesn't leave the EU.
Yeah, exactly.
If it's running in a data center in Frankfurt, you can't wake up in the morning and discover it's now in a data center in South Africa where Sasha will do evil things with it. No, but when he becomes vastly wealthy because of these evil things, he'll send us all presents.
Yeah. So it's a different application to data versus services, right?
Well, yeah, the services, again, I may say this is a service. If you look at anybody that's doing these for government, particularly for ministries of defense, they may put fencing around services so some part of the organization can use it and others can't. It's not the same as classification. That again gets into a different space. But when you think about things like SBOMs, it's fairly unlikely that auditors are going to try and find all the microservices authors. They're going to want to go to somebody that's more of a central point. Tell me all the places log4j shows up in my organization, which is a problem. Organizations have even months after that issue came up.
Yeah, it's true.
And then, you know, again, log of are services being used? Are they not being used? Services can't be maintained for free. If they're not being used, maybe you want to say, well, these 4 services all basically do the same thing. We're going to turn 2 of them off.
Mhm.
So what I was thinking about is, how do I map that back to what I see in Ortelius? And then there's another level of question, which is, what things ought to be in the open source artifact, Ortelius, and what things would be well left for someone wanting to offer a commercial service based upon Ortelius, which obviously could be Deploy Hub, but it could be somebody else too. So anyway, that was pretty much what I'd been thinking about. I don't know how much that makes sense to people.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. What would be your comment on PCI
On
and
which,
Ortelius? PCI compliance.
PCI is a very specific thing. So if a service is going to have to interact with the payment, you're talking about the payment card industry, right?
Yeah.
If a service is handling something like credit card
Yeah.
functionality.
I'm asking because I'm working on a massive project that is the heart of a client that I'm working with, and their e-commerce system is, we are converting it into microservices. So I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about.
Okay,
Say I wanted to implement Ortelius in that system. It would be quite interesting, right?
The first thing I would want to be able to see as a consumer of a service is this service asserting it's PCI compliant? And by the way, which version? PCI is what now? 4.0 is the most current? Or is emerging? I can't remember if 4.0 is current yet.
I'm so glad I don't have to deal with that.
But you know, is this in fact compliant? And there's probably going to be some, again, you come to the notion of service provenance. Someone's asserting compliance. Can I tell who they are? Can I, is there some provenance? If this thing is being run by, say, MasterCard, I'm probably a little more willing to trust it than somebody I've never heard of. But PCI compliance has very much a specific industry spin to it. So I'd want to be able to understand whether microservices were claiming conformance to a version, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that that claim to conformance would be one of those attributes that you'd want to tag onto that version of the service, so people, when they're looking for things, they can search based on a certain compliance level, and et cetera, at that level.
I think so. So if I was, say, Nikita, thinking about this from a UX point of view, I'd probably want there to be some way to browse the catalog so that I can, when designing an application, I can see what's available for me to consume, and then tell my build team, use these. But that requires some user-friendly search capability, I would think.
Yeah, and the way I've seen it, most implementations of a catalog, if you look at Docker Hub, even like PyPy, NPM, those do a tagging type of methodology. So they tag things, and then you can say, give me all these that match this tag. And I think that's something that we should look at implementing, is additional, using those attributes as tags in some way.
And I think we probably do want to be able to allow users of Ortelius to extend the tagging. Something we haven't thought of that matters to them.
Right. Now, one of the things just to kind of throw out there for an architectural point of view is when we have the blockchain ledger, we will have it'll be two-sided. One would be the thought is an open source type of blockchain that would be like all the open source packages and services out there. And then if you're like Sasha, you're working for a bank, you would have your catalog for your internal proprietary applications and the blockchain for that, the ledger. And then you'd federate the two together to pull information about the open source packages that the bank's consuming from the public federated open source ledger. So that would be part of the architectural viewpoint. Is from inside the bank, I can do a search and see all the applications that are consuming log4j. But from the outside, if I'm the log4j team, I should not be able to see which banks are using log4j. And the reason being is if you can go and search and find all the companies that have a vulnerability, then you know who to go attack, and it just simplifies your process of narrowing down exploitation points. So we will have that's why I said it's like it's two different viewpoints. Whether you're inside of a company, looking out to the open source side, and then from the open source side, what you can see from that point of view. Now there are ways to use self-sovereign identity and a third-party type of ledger transaction where you can actually obscure the consumer side. So you could tell that from an open source package, I have 2,000 companies that have that have this vulnerability, but I don't know the name of the companies or any of that contact information. So you can obscure that information through SSI, and that may be something that we would want to consider. But that would be down the road when we get into that type of scenario. Hang on, chat just popped up.
Yeah, that was me. Since we're on this discussion, I went ahead and shared, uploaded the Red Hat requirements document for an attributes catalog. And we're meeting with him at the beginning of the year. I think it's January 4th, maybe.
Cool. Yeah, that'll help getting more of these requirements together. And I think the need to rate a service and add additional attributes to a service is something that we'll need to kind of figure out how, from a UX perspective, how we can do that type of functionality around a particular service.
Yeah, that's something I've been hoping that we would do, rating a service, even if it's just as simple as giving the ability to add a star, or determine its security risk based on the domain it's in, based on how many applications it's being consumed by. Maybe there can be a complexity rating. So I think that one's an interesting one.
Because we'll probably see cases where services are built entirely within the walls of an organization. Microservices are built by a commercial partner.
Exactly.
You have some ability to go back to and know who you can talk to and so on, and things that are published and become considered useful by an open source partner of some sort.
Yeah, I think that we're going to soon see open source libraries be microservices.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why not? We're not compiling code anymore, so why compile all of our open source libraries into a single container and have every single container have to repeat that?
Right. But there'll be people that don't want to do that because they've got some proprietary intellectual property in it. Or like if you think about a service that, these are obviously lots of them out there already, but if you think about a service that gives you an optimal route for a truck making deliveries, if somebody came up with a really clever algorithm that optimized not only time, fuel costs based on picking up all the information on fueling stations and their current prices, they may not want to make that open source. So there'll be those cases too, I think, but
Absolutely.
yeah. Anyway.
And that's where the federated viewpoint allows us to separate the proprietary from public.
Right.
I wouldn't necessarily say open source. Public would be open source plus any public services that companies are deciding to support. Like you said, American Express may have a public service for, doing credit card ratings or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be, I think that's a good viewpoint to have. The where was it? Oh, on the, for tracking like the metrics of a service on how well it's performing, that could be difficult because people may take an open source service and run it locally in their cluster, for example. And that would give it, they just may not give the machine enough horsepower. So they have that service is performing poorer than another company that gives that service some more horsepower. So that one, metrics could be an interesting one to tackle.
So that might be the sort of the non-functional stuff almost would have to be within the context of the organization consuming and running it.
Right.
So the consumer has an opinion, the provider where it's running said, well, I'm constrained because Amazon's charging me like crazy and I can't keep 16 core systems sitting around just in case you want to use them.
Right.
So some of those will be quite tricky, but they go along with the expectations being set by the provider.
Yeah, and I think that may come into the ability to look at, well, there's two aspects to that. One is the SLO, SLA angle. The other one is from the what do you want to call it? So you have the SLO, SLA angle saying that I want to have this service meet this, have this expectation. And I have an agreement about that service. The other way is to look at how that service is going to not only perform, but also the attributes around that service. So I can do something like a policy agent, like open OPA. So I can, as I'm rolling out this service, I can look at the security threat level against it. I can do like you said, the rate to service, does it have a good rating? When was the last time it was updated? The lag time of the current version of the service to the one I'm using.
Mhm.
Those types of attributes you can funnel through OPA to help you make decisions about how to flag that, or either flag it and stop it as part of your pipeline process, or flag it and just review it later type of thing. But I think when we look at the data that we're collecting, we should always think about in the context of a policy agent as well.
I think that's absolutely right, Steve. And if you think about things like utilities tend to have if you're going to build something and deploy it into your network, here are the versions of things that we've blessed. And that means your DevOps or DevSecOps pipeline has to understand you can only use these versions of things, even if there are other versions available. So again, policy gets in there. Okay,
Yeah.
this is what I wanted to present and, maybe start some discussion about. Not sure where you would like to go with this, Steve, but
I think looking at the list, I think for the most part, we are addressing in some fashion most of this. The part that we're definitely lacking is in the rating system and the additional attributes, like you're saying. Well, the rating system, additional attributes on how to find things, and the ability to browse, and the browsing and finding services world.
so maybe the question might be, for example, does Ortelius, as an open source project, want to publish an API for that? And then someone as a commercial implementer offers that browsing capability, or does Ortelius want to include that in the open source? I don't know the answer to that.
I think we should include it in the open source, and this is where I'm going to push over to the UX UI professionals on what is the best way to find something in a large amount of data. Is it going to be tagging? Is it going to be, free-form search? What is the best way to organize that data for finding what you need at that level? And like I said, the ones that I've seen, if you look at Docker Hub, just the core Docker blessed images is 17,000 versions and tags. So and if you look at PyPy, I think PyPy has 230,000 versions of modules out there, and I'm sure NPM's even larger, probably into the millions. So those are catalogs I think we should kind of look at and see if what they've done is something that we should adopt at that level, or if we need to have something more creative for us, put it that way.
Yeah, so Steve and the team, I have one question for all of you. How we are looking at policy and the governance in the Ortelius catalog?
So what do you mean by policy, Simon?
So actually, I'm meaning by the policy, let's say somebody is using microservices as a containers, and the container has, there's a base images and all these kind of capabilities, and they want to restrict the vulnerable base images to be deployed on the Ortelius catalog. So do we have rules for that? I assure we can use a policy engine like Kyverno who can help achieve this. This is one example, but you can stretch this example to some other categories as well. Like I want some of my the registries or where I'm deploying the images to is not from the Red Hat or QA. I want these images to come from the Docker Hub, let's say, or I don't want the images to be pulled from Docker Hub. So these are different kind of policies, but what is actually our right now, do we have focus on these areas or not?
We've talked about policies, and kind of the viewpoint that I have is we need to gather all the data and expose that data so people can make a policy decision. Because those policy decisions are going to be controlled by the company that's using that service, for example. I may decide that, for example, I may decide as my company's policy, I'm going to allow any images out there that have a critical vulnerability to run, where another company may say, I want to have I want to have the next level down, medium level vulnerabilities or low level vulnerabilities are able to run. So as long as we provide that information to the end user and allow them to query that information easily, they can put that into their policy engine to decide what's going to happen, whether they're going to block something from being distributed to a production environment or not. That's kind of the viewpoint that I've been thinking about. Does that help, Simon? I think Simon, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear. Another question, Steve, like, I believe this is the last meeting of 2022 for Ortelius. So one thing I want to learn from you guys is, I think Brad and we see a lot of interest in the backstages, the internal developer platforms, and the backstage is actually a kind of implementation for that. So Ortelius plus backstage, how we look at it?
Yeah, so that's on the screen here on the bottom left, on the authoring part. When you, as a microservice developer, you want to set up a new microservice. So one of the things, just to everybody give it back a 5-second background on Backstage. Backstage, basically what it does, you register your service with Backstage, and as part of that, you click basically check off some check boxes saying, I want this new service to be written in Node.js. I want it to be published to Kubernetes. The pipeline I want to use is going to be Jenkins as the pipeline image pipeline tool. And you hit go. And when you hit go, Backstage will actually generate you a sample Node.js application for your microservice, generate the Jenkins file for you, connect it up to your clusters that you have, and actually deploy that all the way out to production in a single go. So you actually have a test microservice running in production, and all the plumbing for that the DevOps teams normally do is done by Backstage. Now, where Ortelius hooks into that is in two spots. One spot is in when the pipeline is generated, we want to hook in the Ortelius CLI into that pipeline. That allows us to grab when that service is built, we grabbed our catalog information from there. And then the second part where we hook in is on the deployment side. When it gets deployed, we want to get notified that the deployment happened. So let's say they're using, as part of that process, they're going to tack on Argo CD and Captain as their deployment tool and their gatekeeper of the cluster. We would then hook into the Captain side to get notifications through Captain that a deployment happened as part of that. So that's how Backstage and Ortelius kind of get hooked together. And the Backstage part is basically done once when the developer kind of creates or updates. You know, they want to create a new major version of a service. That's where Backstage gets involved.
Yeah,
yes, thank you.
But yeah, Steve, I think one thing which I've seen and I've used Backstage in recent times is it gives you, it's a template based approach, right? It's not that, you know, you can templatize as per your organization need, that if I need to customize it. So Backstage is giving me a platform rather than just a solution. It's just that I can customize that as per my need. I think is this, because then I can change it to my organization need of how I am developing services. What I'm using Jenkins or something else, I can still change it as per what I need.
Right,
Because
and that's
yeah,
exactly, and that's where the Backstage templating comes into play. And one of the things that when we do our Backstage, I can't remember if they call them plugins or add-ins.
yeah.
That's where they would choose to include Ortelius into their template as part of that process.
So I mean, is Ortelius now listed as a Backstage in the marketplace of the catalog which they have, or no?
Not yet. We're working on that.
Oh, okay.
So that's one of the things that Brad McCoy is working on in Australia is there's a front end plugin and then there's a
back end plugin, yeah.
Back end plugin, and we'll actually have both at that level. From what I looked at, I talked to, I can't remember her name, from Rody, who's the commercial or the SaaS version of Backstage.
Yeah. No, I used Rody too,
Martina.
and yeah, I think the Rody is a better version because it gives you your setup and everything is done, and I think they have much better support for Backstage because any help you need. And so I think the essence is that what Tony was earlier talking about, you know, that for microservices we need observability, FinOps, or cost management. We can get a view of different things. Who's using all that is something, if we plug ourselves into Backstage lifecycle, because Backstage is pluggable, we can use other providers to do those things, right? Or we are thinking of Ortelius can also get into those areas and start doing something more than a Backstage.
I wouldn't say that we would become a project platform. I think that if people want to do that, they should be using something like Backstage.
Yeah, so we would have our front end and back end plugins, and those plugins would allow us to get inserted into the customer's pipeline in the right places, so we can then start gathering the catalog information when they go through and run their pipelines.
Okay.
So one of the reasons why I think that is because Backstage is actually part of the problem when it comes to creating a more agile DevOps pipeline, because it generates these basically pipeline workflow files for it if we're, you know, whatever microservice or API that you've registered with it. Now, let's say that the company wants to switch from Sonatype to JFrog. You have to go and you have to update all of those already generated pipeline files manually. And that's why CD events is becoming more important, is because it creates a more agile pipeline. And if CD events is out there, then you don't need something like Backstage.
Well, you still would to connect things together. It'd just be doing it differently.
Well, when you have it done in one place and have one big templated file that everybody was using, and if it gets updated, it gets updated everywhere? Or do you still have, in a CD events world, do you still have everybody with a scripted pipeline workflow?
I'd have to double check, but I think you are still scripting the pipeline together.
So it
But
doesn't solve that problem.
what it does is you script your pipeline together to say, I want to do a build, I want to do a push, I want to do a security scan, then I want to do a release or deployment. That is your scripted pipeline. And if you want to plug in SNCC versus white
So you
source.
just say, you don't name it, you don't hard code the name, you hard code the action.
Right.
And then the name is substituted.
Right.
But if you code a full pipeline, and even if you don't have the tool, it'll just skip that spot.
I think
Yeah, it ignores it because there's nothing for it to call. And so it passes nothing to its payload is 0 to the next step.
right.
So it's just a more agile pipeline. I don't know how much people are going to need something like Backstage when you have a template that is so generic, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. And that's where the complexity comes, like, we've seen companies where they have 15 QA environments for one project, so that's where it's going to be interesting on how that fits into that solution.
So
Yeah,
we're gonna continue work with the CD events team at the CD Foundation and really look to see how that's going to shake out.
Yes, and for our implementation, like on the let's say we want to, they've put Captain into their cluster, and we want to know when a deployment has been completed. We would be listening for a cloud event from Captain to tell us that something's been completed. So when we're integrating with these other tools, that we'd be doing it on a cloud event type of payload to make it generic. So if they take out Captain and put in something else, let's say they're just using Argo CD and leaving Captain out, we could listen for an Argo CD cloud event saying that the deployment was finished. It would be basically the same event, it's just a different producer. It's the same cloud event that we're listening for, but a different producer, whether it's going to be Argo versus Captain.
Yes. Steve, one question from my side as well is, like, for the Backstage, who is actually what is actually attended audience is for the Backstage? Is for everyone, or just for the developer, for the platform engineers, the cluster administrator? Because I see the wave right now is people building the internal developer platform, so developer can use that platform to run application on top of it. That's how I see the IDPs. But what is actually the attended audience for the Backstage? Is for everyone, for the program managers to the CTO of the company? What is actually the attended audience for the Backstage?
It is kind of twofold. One is it's the developer. So the developer wants to create a new service. And when they create the new service, they're going to create it in a particular language, and they get get a stubbed out starting point for that new service. So that's kind of from the developer's perspective. Now that developer wants to get that new service out to production. And that's where the DevOps engineers come into play. And normally the DevOps engineers have to go and manually create a Jenkins file, for example. Then they have to manually go configure a namespace in the Kubernetes cluster. And then they need to go and configure Prometheus. And then they need to go configure, Stack Driver for looking at the logs, for example. Or Grafana to watch the transactions. So the DevOps engineer is actually where all the heavy lifting happens. And this is why Backstage came about out of Spotify, is they had so many microservices that they're creating that they couldn't, the DevOps team couldn't keep up with creating all these doing all these manual steps to onboard somebody. To onboard a new developer, a new service for a developer was taking a week, going through and pointing and clicking and copying and pasting and all that stuff. So that's where it came from, was using this templating idea to go ahead and get it rolled out quickly within just a couple minutes when you point and click and say go. So it's the audience is typically the DevOps engineer, is where they're going to allow fewer DevOps engineers to be able to support more teams for the developers to be onboarded.
It's aiding like a self-service, like I'm going to a buffet. I call it the buffet, like going to the hotel buffet.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yes.
Just choose the meal that I want, and it could be a Jenkins meal, it could be whatever meal.
Exactly.
That's how I think of it,
in that you have the DevOps teams and the the release managers and the production control teams get to pick and choose the constraints that they want to put the developers into.
Wow.
So, for example, the production control can, in the template, say you're only going to deploy to AWS. We're not going to allow you to go to Azure. So that's where the controls come into play through Backstage. It's just like Ankar was saying, it's a giant templating engine.
Keeping the developers away from infrastructure.
The way I have used it in my organization is that, but there is a part of the ugly part is that because it's open, you end up customizing it a lot, right? Because you are extending as per what your organization needs, right? Because every organization has different tools, technologies, so you end up customizing it a lot, and you need to definitely that platform engineering team needs to learn Backstage to that extent that they should be able to support all these nuances of how people want to see Backstage as. So
yeah, and that's where we've always thought, this is always a dream that companies had, what was going to be, I'm going to standardize on Azure pipelines, and you get a consulting company that comes in to write a project, and they want to do everything in GitHub Actions and GitHub. So now you have to support all of Azure pipelines plus GitHub as your platforms now. And that's one thing that people always thought that would happen, is everybody would be on the same technology stack and the same SCM tools and the same end-time runtime environment, and that's just not the case. And like you said, Ankar, it's the customization of the templates is where you put a lot of work, but once you put the work in place, onboarding people through those templates is very easy then.
Yeah. And there are multiple other companies now, ops level, there is like Humanitech, and like this is pretty hot market that they are building the IDPs like we are talking about. But I think the value is, like you said, Steve, it's more about how you can make your developer more productive so that they focus more on writing the service rather than something which is around the service. They don't need to worry about that. So
yeah, and that's the thing that you don't, even though developers love the script, you don't want them in there scripting Jenkins files and having different Jenkins files for every single service because they decided to do something slightly different. One developer may want to script all the Docker build commands, where another developer may use some reusable Jenkins library that the DevOps team's written. And that's the type of thing that you want you want developers working on developing end user or code that's going to make money for the company instead of them wasting time on things that are just more.
Yeah, I think the way we have implemented in one organization is that even the Git repo you don't need to create. Everything is done through the portal only. So basically, the you don't have to worry about now that how how you are setting up the code. Everything is kind of automated now. You just have to launch that utility to get this created. Yeah, I think the challenge which I have seen is that the more complex your application or the organization becomes, I think you need to support all these use cases. But the easy part is at least you have some consistency going on. Otherwise, it's like everybody is doing something of their own.
Yeah, and the problem still exists with most of the CI/CD pipeline tools is those themselves aren't templated. So like Tracy was saying, if you want to go in and switch out a security scan tool for projects that have already been created through Backstage, you're going to have to go do those manually. There's not going to be another automation process to do that. And from the Ortelius side, where we fit is we want to be able to be inserted into the pipeline, into the right places automatically. So we start gathering the data without the developers having to go and configure anything for Ortelius. And once we start gathering the data, then we can start doing the fun things like we've been talking about today, being able to rate something, be able to look at statistics, metrics, those type of things is where we are able to pull all that information together into a single hub that we can make decisions from.
Yes, and for my final question, do you tell companies to use Backstage or to create your own IDPs?
I think the answer is mixed, right? Because it all depends on different companies. Like I am working for mostly financial firms, and like some of them have opted for it, and some of them are, they said, no, we want to do, like one company is a banking firm and they decided to build their own platform, but they have now a 10 people team supporting building that platform because their environment is like they have around 6,000 developers, so they are definitely building their own platform. But like the other company, which is a small bank, they are using Backstage because it's easier, and especially with solution like Rodi, it's a SaaS version of Backstage, so you can actually even don't need to maintain the kind of thing. All you need to write is templatize what you want to do for your organization. So maybe but I think connecting the dot to Ortelius, I think, are we gonna be then, like question Steve, that we're gonna be more like a Backstage oriented provider or something where we are competing with Backstage in that space? Or
no, we're going to be adding our plugins to the marketplace.
Okay, their marketplace.
Yeah, so we've already talked to the Rodi folks about adding to their marketplace, and they said whenever our stuff is good to go, they'll go ahead and basically help us do a pull request to add it to the Rodi marketplace. And as far as the generic Backstage, I have not looked into that on what we need to do on that front.
Yeah, they have a different marketplace, but I think Rodi is also listed on the Backstage marketplace. So if I look at the marketplace of Backstage, Rodi is there. So that's how we looked up Rodi and their components. So yeah,
so kind of like a federated marketplace.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think, like, Steve, do you know anyone from the Backstage? It's a good topic to discuss on the Paying Ortelius podcast. Have you know anyone from the team?
We know folks from the Rodi side, but not from Backstage per se.
Open source. I think might be Tracy knows someone. I can talk with her.
Yeah. We can probably hunt somebody down. We'll have to look and see what they're up to. Is Backstage is in CNCF, right?
Yeah, that is an incubation. They have, I think, applying for graduation, but
Right. All right, we're coming up on the end of the hour. Any other questions? Thank you, Tony, for putting this together and getting the ideas down. I will go ahead and create some issues next week around some of the items that we discussed, just so we don't lose track of them, and we can divide them into like features that we want to start working on.
Sounds good. Happy holidays to everybody. If we don't talk, and we probably won't before the new year.
Alrighty, happy holidays, everybody. Thanks. Don't work too hard through the new year.
Oh, thank you.
And
Really cool discussion.
Yep. And I will be throwing things out onto our Discord channel when I get issues created and stuff like that. So I'll keep you posted that way.
Yes, Steve. And finally, I have a Ortelius
There you
jacket, hoodie,
Nice.
and now I am super ready for the outrage next year.
Awesome.
There's been UFO sightings in Pakistan.
Yeah. This is
Sasha,
this is our final.
Sasha, I think yours is on a boat somewhere out in the South Pacific.
Mine's getting delivered by a real UFO, so I can't wait.
All righty. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye,
Yeah.
everyone. Have a wonderful new year.
Yeah, you too.